Welcome to OOD Works, the podcast, a show about unique individuals and the services provided by Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, the state agency that helps individuals with disabilities find a job and be more independent. Here's your host, Kim Jump.
In this episode of OOD Works, the podcast, we're joined by our director, Kevin Miller, and our Chief Financial Officer, Maria Seaman. Maria has been with OOD since June 2011, and she had served as our agency budget manager for over 7 years. She began her career in state government in 1997 under the Legislative Service Commission's fellowship program and remained on staff there for nearly 14 years, where she covered primarily health and human services agencies and legislation. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies from the University of Buffalo and has a Master of Public Administration degree from North Carolina State University. And the reason we're joined by Director Miller and Maria is because at the end of January 2023, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine announced his biennial executive budget for fiscal years 2024 and 2025. It's wonderful news for OOD. So Director Miller, welcome. Why don't you give us a brief overview of the budget before we break it down?
Everything's great. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Go out on a high note. No, this budget request that Governor DeWine has put together really shows an investment in individuals with disabilities. It shows individuals with disabilities in Ohio matter, and it is a true reinforcement to his executive order that he signed moments after taking the oath of office 4 years ago, saying that Ohio would be a disability inclusion state and a model employer. And so I'm looking forward to getting into a little bit more detail, but I think the high level things is that full match will mean really securing a legacy for Governor DeWine that this level of support had never been seen before. I mean, you're talking about an additional $10 to $11 million in general revenue over the 2 years of the biennium. And I won't steal Maria's thunder because she really knows this much better. But that will allow us in the second year, because we do need time to ramp these things up that involve staff and other things. But by the end of that second year, we will be securing $77.5 million in federal VR grants over that biennium. So that's quite an investment when you're looking at both state and federal, almost $100 million for individuals with disabilities, which funds a lot of the things we've been doing over the last 11 years, like our College to Careers, with our partnership with Ohio Ed, our Jobs for Recovery with mental health and addiction services, with our drug courts, our Ohio Transition Support Partnerships with the Ohio Department of Education, and Employment First with the Department of Developmental Disabilities. And I think this will also allow us, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about it, some new things we're going to be able to do with these additional funds.
Well, and why don't you just give a teaser before we break down the numbers with Maria? the brand new initiative that's also included. Would you explain that?
When I was told my son had autism, I didn't think about what he could do. I didn't think about services that would be available from a variety of agencies. I thought about all the negatives first. I thought about, is he ever going to be able to graduate high school? Is he ever going to be able to have a relationship? Is he ever going to be able to live on his own? Is he going to be a victim? And as a parent, your parental instincts first are always about protection. It's not about all the wonderful things. Like, I didn't want to think about letting him go out into the world and be vulnerable. And so we have to change mindsets, because we know with inclusion, we know in education now, I've talked many times showing my age, when I was growing up, I had friends that I only saw at recess and at lunch because they were separated. They were in a learning disabled classroom, or LD classroom as it was called back then. Now it's all integrated. You have kids of various levels all together, and we see that it works. And so we have to start changing parents' minds more than it is the kids' minds. And so we're really excited about this new initiative called Accessible Ohio. And I think Governor DeWine has done things like Recovery Ohio. He's done H2 Ohio to talk about drinking water and preserving lands and making sure people have a mental health services that they need. This is in that same vein. Accessible Ohio is really about a new era of disability inclusion in Ohio. It's transformational. I love being able to say that about accessibility to everything our great state has to offer. It's really about how we can do a cultural change. And now this is going to happen overnight. I want to just make sure I say that. To run a marathon, you got to take the first step out of the starting gate, right? You got 26.3 miles to go. You can't think about the end because I don't think there is a finish line in this, but it's about changing the cultural thought processes of families who start to grow up believing that they matter and that they can go and do things within Ohio as soon as possible and be able to see the things about what accommodation and accessibility is all about. So to give you an example of maybe some of those things. Right now, there's no singular agency or body that is responsible for trying to set standards except now we're not talking about ADA and Title I about things like bathrooms and ramps and things like that. Gotcha. I'm talking about things like if you go to a museum and you have, I've been to many museums. I enjoy going to museums, but sometimes there's video displays, there's other things. Well, if you're someone who is visually impaired or blind, you're not really enjoying what that display is. If you go in and something's not closed captioned, someone who's deaf is not going to be able to do that. What Accessible Ohio does will enable us to hire staff who are not funded through vocational rehabilitation, which has those ropes attached that you can only do things that are attached to an individual with an open case. This actually has us being proactive. So we'll be able to work with airports, museums, local cities and communities, large and small, things in rural communities, our colleges and universities. What if in every aspect of life, whether you live in Conneaut, Ohio, all the way down to Cincinnati and everywhere in between, and we have a focused effort on all of those things that are inclusive, whether you go to a park and there's a playground, which we've worked with, accessible playgrounds with a good friend of mine, Director Mary Mertz with the Department of Natural Resources, to local communities who've asked us, we would like to upgrade our parking to make it a more change from handicap parking to accessible parking, a more inclusive and I think modern term, and using the more modern placard that is used that's more inclusive. And how can we do that? And so we've tried to help them, but we can't really use money or anything like that, or even consult more on a full-time basis. And so Accessible Ohio will be able for us to be able to start working with them. For instance, the Department of Developmental Disabilities, a good friend, Director Hauk, has money set aside in her budget specifically to give grants to local communities to install adult changing stations. Think about this. You've got people who are caregivers who have individuals they're caring for who they have to provide basic toiletry needs. You can't go to the state fair. You can't go to the Museum of Natural History in Cleveland. You can't go to the Toledo Museum of Art and everything in between if you don't have an adult changing station there while you're visiting. So Director Hauk will be able to provide some funding there, and our Accessible Ohio staff can work closely with them about here's the vendors that you can purchase these from. This is how much it costs. Here's the different types. Here's charging stations. As we know, we have individuals in Ohio that are growing older. Our population is growing older, and onset disability is going to occur. I think we saw last summer at the state fair a tremendous amount of mobility scooters. They're not just wheelchairs, but mobility scooters for our aged population to get around. You're going to need more of those things, and it needs to be more of a conscious effort about what you're doing in Ohio, from going to Kings Island and Cedar Point to traveling and going through the airport, whatever airport you may be going through, and working with TSA to talk about where are there things here in this airport to help people who are blind, to help people who have sensory integration, to help people who are deaf, to help people understand that they could also understand instructions that they're getting to be able to make their travel safe. So I could talk for another 2 hours about this and the podcast, but I would just say, to remind everybody, this is the beginning. We've been given a blank canvas, which is a tremendous responsibility, but we're given the freedom to say, go out. We know this is important. Start setting standards. Start going out and working with people to educate them and make them aware of how every aspect of life, from when a child not just gets up, but goes to school, how they get to school, how they play on the playground, how we start talking about what they can do instead of what they can't do.
Excellent. This is really exciting news for Ohioans with disabilities. Maria, the director mentioned some financials, but could you just break down the numbers behind the proposed budget?
Thanks, Kim. Well, as Director Miller mentioned, the governor's executive budget as proposed includes approximately $27.2 million in general revenue funds for OOD in the first year, and then $32.4 million in the second year of the biennium. And so those funds, the majority of that GRF funding, along with matching funds that we receive from our state and local partners, will allow OOD to maximize our federal resources that are allocated to Ohio. So as Director Miller mentioned, that means we're going to have the full match by the end of the second year of the biennium, which will allow us to serve more than 41,000 Ohioans with disabilities on an annual basis. So that's really exciting news for us. To give you a little bit more detail on some of our state level partnerships, in addition to our ongoing partnership with the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities around Employment First, we're going to be expanding our partnership with the Ohio Department of Education for our Ohio Transition Support Partnership. So currently, the Ohio Department of Education transfers $3.5 million a year to OOD for that partnership, but they're going to be increasing that partnership in the proposed budget to $5.5 million in the first year of the biennium, and then to $6.5 million by the second year of the biennium. So that is an exciting expansion to our Ohio Transition Support Partnership, which will allow us to expand our services to high school students. In addition, we're going to be increasing our support of our College to Careers program by receiving $2 million in each of the state fiscal years from the Ohio Department of Higher Education to be able to expand our services and support of college students on campuses across the state. So that's really exciting news for the agency.
It really is. And, when Governor DeWine announced the financial support for college students with disabilities, there's been a lot of excitement around this. So just to be clear, will that kind of financial support for college students with disabilities be continued beyond this school year?
Yes, with full match, we will have so many options to be able to expand services in many different areas, including ongoing support for our college students.
Great news for them and individuals with disabilities across the board, across the state. That's wonderful. What about community centers for the deaf?
Yeah, so the governor's proposed budget includes an investment of an additional $500,000 annually for the community centers for the deaf, which will allow them to increase services for Ohioans who are deaf or hard of hearing. So that's really good news for those individuals that are served across the state by our community centers for the deaf partners.
It really is. Director, one of the things that may surprise listeners with the executive budget is language that creates a penalty enhancement for crimes against Ohioans with disabilities. Can you just tell us about that?
Yeah, this is something that we have been working on for some time. I think you've seen OOD take a leadership role in some legislation going all the way back to the communication disability law that we wrote and worked closely with members of the General Assembly to talk about protections for individuals with disabilities. And one of the things that we've been working on is to try to explain that we're one of only 14 states that didn't have basically hate crime language for a crime that's committed against individuals because of their disability. So I want to make sure I explain what that means. This isn't one of those things where it's like, okay, you're walking down the street and you have autism and someone beats you up, and then after the fact they realized you had a disability, so there's a penalty enhancement because of that. What this language does is it specifically adds, based on the definition of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that if you specifically target an individual to commit a crime against them because of their disability. So maybe one of the most common things that I have heard in our research and where other states have included this is where, for instance, someone who's blind, who's running like one of our blind enterprise programs like micro markets or something like that. And because that person is blind, you steal money from them that's on the counter or something like that. Or that an individual, there was a very tragic case in Chicago where some students who pretended to be friends with a young man with autism lured him away into an abandoned house and then live streamed on Facebook, torturing him, putting cigarette butts out on him and things like that. They did that specifically because they knew he had autism and knew that they could lure him away. We've seen other examples of this in a variety of different disability groups. So what this penalty enhancement does is it says if the crime level that you're being charged with would be, let's say, a felony 4, if there's evidence to show there was thought behind the idea that you targeted this individual because they had a disability, it would then increase the penalty from a felony 4 to a felony 3. Okay. If it's a misdemeanor, like a misdemeanor 2, it would make it a misdemeanor 1. So it would mean an increased penalty. But I want to make sure everyone understands it can't be after the fact. It's not like, oh, I robbed somebody and then afterwards I realized they were deaf. No, it would be because you knew the person was deaf and you made them the target because of their disability. And I think it's a very well balanced approach. It also shows Governor DeWine's commitment to law enforcement and supporting individuals with disabilities not being a target, and showing that you will be held to a higher standard if you do this against an individual with a disability because they have a disability. So it's a very unfortunate topic, but it's good news for us to be able to have this, being able to add Ohio to the many other states that have added this hate crime type language to protect individuals with disabilities.
Good. Maria, I know our vocational rehabilitation program works with hundreds of providers and organizations that do a lot of the hands-on services to our participants who are working on finding and keeping a job. What does this budget mean for them?
Thanks, Kim. Our counselors serve individuals in all 88 counties in Ohio, which means we have providers across the state. And our federal rules require that only our counselor can do certain things, like make eligibility determinations, develop a plan for employment, authorize for services, approve payments, and complete the case and close it when the person has left our services. And we do this by purchasing a wide range of vocational rehabilitation services from those hundreds of providers from across Ohio. So, we will be looking at our fee schedule as we proceed through this budget. These additional dollars in our budget means a greater investment for each person that we serve. It means we'll be serving more people. We're looking for increases in quality of services that are provided. And so this infusion of state dollars allowing us to maximize our federal match by the second year of the biennium means we'll be able to serve an additional 6,000 individuals with disabilities on an annual basis. And that means providing increased support for the vocational rehabilitation services that they need, along with education and credentials and assistive technology. So lots of investments will be made to benefit not only the individuals that we serve, but also our providers throughout the state that are vital to the work of our program.
Excellent. I want to ask you a similar question, Director. We have a lot of employer partners in the state, hundreds of them. How is the governor's proposed budget going to impact the businesses that we partner with?
We are always going to be committed about what it means for the people we serve. We talk all the time internally about we need to keep who we serve in mind. And at the core of our mission is getting individuals with disabilities employed. Employers drive the vocational rehabilitation process now. It's not VR driving that. Because we have to understand an employer, when they want someone now. They don't want a lot of extra work that goes along with it. That's where our counselors and our business relations staff, as I like to say, reverse engineer. We go to the businesses first. And, we have a who's list of employers, but it also means the local mom and pop stores that are interested in wanting to hire individuals locally that they might have a relationship with in their schools to work at their ice cream stores or their grocery stores or what have you. We need to make sure that individuals with disabilities know what the job market means. We've got to understand what the business is. We got to understand what is it that the skills are necessary to have to do the type of work that you do here. With these funds, we'll also be able to increase internships where we're taking some fear out of. We'll pay for, a period of time for their wage. So you can basically see how this individual can work. And then that's where we've seen probably our strongest connections with businesses when we go into it with the idea of how can we remove the barriers for the business to get over the mindset of hiring individuals with disabilities. Because as I've said with the Accessible Ohio, the first thing people are thinking about is, unfortunately, the things they can't do. Am I going to get sued? Can I say hi to somebody who's blind? How do I address someone? That's why we do things like disability etiquette training. It's why we talk about how you try to foster an environment of what that means. And I always like to remind everybody, guess what? You already have people with disabilities working there. You just don't know it. They haven't disclosed it. And so if you're able to make that environment more attractive, you're going to attract more workers. And everybody right now is trying to figure out how to bring in more people to their organization to work.
Excellent. It's a win-win. What happens next in this budget process?
Well, if some of you who are as old as I am remember your schoolhouse rock that I'm just a bill. Well, it's just a bill right now. The budget is a bill that's been introduced now in the Ohio House of Representatives. Director Murnix starts that process off by testifying about the general high-level, macro-level budget for the state of Ohio and Governor DeWine's vision with that budget. And then the Ohio House of Representatives has subcommittees of the Finance Committee. So there will be members of the large Finance Committee that then break up based on topic levels. So there's criminal justice, there's education, there's transportation. We have not heard yet which subcommittee we will be in. It's usually either in Health and Human Services or Jobs and Economic Employment, something along those lines. That will be an opportunity for me to testify before the subcommittee and lay out our vision that we've talked about a little bit here and maybe in a little bit more detail, but also allows those members then to ask me questions about, so tell me a little bit more about this Accessible Ohio. What do you mean by maybe they're not familiar with charging stations or adult changing stations or disability etiquette training. And so that allows me to educate them. And I'll be doing one-on-one meetings, by the way, over the next several months with everyone, every member who's part of the House Finance, also in leadership. Once that is then completed, it's voted on by the Ohio House of Representatives, and then it goes over to the Senate. And as Bill says, and I'm just a bill, and then the whole process starts all over again. So then we will testify in front of the Senate Finance Committee. I'll be having individual meetings to make sure we are educating and talking about any items that maybe representatives or senators may have questions about. Once that's voted on out of the Senate, it then goes to what's called a conference committee, because we know there'll be some differences between what the House passes and what the Senate passes. And so that conference committee has representatives from the governor, from the House, and from the Senate, and they work to iron those differences out. And by law, we have to have a balanced budget signed by July 1 of this year. So that's kind of the high-level time frame. But I will tell you, I will be very busy, and all of our staff will be very busy over the next 4 to 5 months.
It sounds like it, especially you. We want our listener support too.
Absolutely. If you're an individual with a disability, you have a relationship with your state representative, state senator, make sure if you have a relationship with them or you listen and follow what that is, let them know, educate them how this is such a great opportunity, really transformative. I've said this before, and I try not to use hyperbole that isn't accurate, but we've never seen something like this. And this type of one time, at this point in time, I don't want to make it sound like it's only one time, but where we're at now compared to where we were before is transformative. And it's not just the dollars, but it's what we can do with those dollars. And our commitment will always be to still be cognizant of, our lean principles and looking at efficiencies and making sure that we're doing things the right way and that we're accountable to both the United States Department of Education and the Social Security Administration, which is our two federal oversight agencies that have those grants that we match with and bring down. And obviously the state of Ohio and the auditor of state and the things that we have to do to make sure the money's being spent the way it is and that we're able to prove that who we partner with is spending the money the way it needs to be spent. So we're committed with that. And I think that's why we're at this point to where we see this investment. We've been able to be innovative. We've been transparent. And that's part of our culture, and that will continue. And so that's why I think we have to have that in mind as we talk about all the great things we're going to be doing. We have to remind everybody, though, we have to pay attention to detail as well.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, as we move toward closing, I wondered if each of you, and Maria, we'll start with you first, but if both of you could share if there's one thing you would want listeners to remember from this budget discussion, what would it be? Maria?
One of the things you mentioned in the opening when you introduced me was my time working at the Legislative Service Commission. And so my involvement with OOD actually didn't start in 2011. When I worked at LSC, this agency was one of the agencies that I tracked through the legislative process on a every year. And I worked on their budget from the legislative side. And so as Director Miller mentioned, this really is a historic investment for individuals with disabilities. I've watched, from a distance, working on the legislative side of government, the transformation that this agency went through when funding was cut, and then to see the funding to get to where it is today really is very historic. It will be the largest VR budget in the agency's history. And I spend a lot of my time looking at numbers, tracking the agency's budget, from a high level, but also, detailed spending by program and division. And so there's lots of moving parts within this agency from a funding perspective. So I feel the weight that this huge investment will be and the responsibility that OOD will have and what it will take for us to work together with the program leadership to implement these investments. So insofar as it's a huge responsibility, it's also a huge opportunity for us to make a difference in the lives of those that we serve. And so, it's a privilege to be a part of OOD and to be a part of the work that we're doing to change lives. And I'm so excited about what the next 2 years will hold and beyond for this agency, and especially those we serve.
I hope they get done after listening to this and go, wow, that is pretty incredible, because when I think about things like a legacy for the governor, return on investments, partnerships, credential attainment, higher wages, transformational. I hope everybody can walk away from this. There's so many words, but if I had to pick one, it's transformational. We've been on this trajectory for a while, and now it's like we got to jump into hyperspace on the Millennium Falcon, I'm a Star Wars fan. So I'm just really, I feel like my job now as the coach is to make sure everybody understands what that means. And that question is very important. And so what I'm hoping with Accessible Ohio and Full Match, that's just opening this big giant door in Ohio to have everybody understand not just what OOD can do, but our partners throughout the state and our sister agencies can do to help people with disabilities find employment, gain independence, increase their social standing. All of those things are important. And I think Governor DeWine's budget, and I think Governor DeWine's commitment, even outside of the budget, is reflective that if I had to also say one sentence, it would be this budget puts purpose and meaning behind the statement, Ohioans with disabilities matter.
A transcript of today's episode is available at ood.ohio.gov/podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating and review. We're on social media at Ohio OOD. Do you have a disability? Do you want a job? We can help. oodworks.com.